Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mystery of Faith, a podcast about understanding the Christian religion. I am Kevin, and with me today is
Jacob.
And just to summarize again what we do here, our goal is to help people understand more about the Christian faith and to answer questions that are asked of us. Anyone can ask questions on our Facebook page, which you can find by searching for Mystery of Faith, Understanding the Christian Religion on Facebook, or you can email us at mysteryoffaithpdx@gmail.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can with answers to your questions. So, without further ado, today Jacob has a question for us that he's going to be answering. Jacob, take it away.
Yeah, so one of the questions that we were asked was if patriotism is a Christian virtue. Is it a good thing? So I think really what we need to think about first is, what is patriotism? I think it's pretty obvious. Patriotism is just loyalty and support for your country in its most noble form. That's how you define it. And for your country or for your nation. So it's loyalty for a nation, but what is a nation? And you have to forgive me if I'm upsetting anyone by saying this, but a nation it's not a person. A nation does not have a soul. A nation it's nothing more than an administration. The creation of nations is not any more deep than an effort at organizing people and land and ideas, and what the best way to manage those two things are. That's what a nation's for. That's why it's there. That's why it exists. Country borders don't naturally exist or anything like that. Really, my main point is that a nation is a purely practical thing. The affection and support it deserves through the means of patriotism surrounds only around how good of a job that nation is doing at organizing its people and its land. Meaning, it makes sense to be proud of what sort of progress your country has made in making the lives of its citizens better, and that it is making positive contributions to the large world at large. And by all means, America does do this in a lot of different ways. America, when you put it next to all the different countries in the whole world, it is definitely on the better end of things, I would probably say. I'm very thankful that I am in a country that doesn't have people murdered for not voting for the same candidate that's been reelected for the last 20 years. I'm thankful that I'm in a country that is willing to say it's not legal for companies to make their employees live in the factories they work in and to work in those factories for 15 hours a day. I'll even say that despite all the serious, nasty flaws that we still face on this subject, America is actually one of the least racist countries in the world, I would say. I don't know, you look at... it really is. I think so. You may disagree. But if you're looking at the whole world, you'd be surprised. I'm happy about those things. It's not wrong to be enthusiastic about your country insofar as that your country is succeeding. Patriotism could be all argued as a healthy thing in another way as well. There is virtue in prioritizing who you're going to lend yourself to. For example, it's proper that you would give money to your family or friends if they're in need before you give that same money to strangers who are in the same sort of need, because they are more within your sphere of responsibility. So that's what I'm trying to say is we all have like these spheres of responsibility, and what fits in those spheres, you're going to work towards those first and help those things first. And it makes sense that a person's country has a place in their sphere of responsibility, at least to some extent. If my country was experiencing serious famine and we were sending famine relief to another country who's experiencing the same sort of famine, and not helping ourselves, that would be a problem. If that's how you want to define being patriotic, then I think patriotism is a good thing. But my question at this point really is whether or not those things I described is the nature and the foundation for what motivates people to feel to want to participate in patriotism, to be patriotic. Is that the nature of the thinking for most self-professing patriots? Is their approval and affection for their country this thought out and nuanced? Because I'll tell you what I see, and that's that the average patriot, if you look at someone who's going to say that they're a patriot, their love for their country tends to come across, to me, as very primal, often manic, if I want to be real about it, and worst of all, is completely arbitrary as to what is motivating them to feel patriotism. I really get this impression that patriotic people feel that it's just this kind of required virtue to have this burning passion for your country for no other reason other than the fact that it's your country. It's the thing that you belong to. I don't think that many Americans realize how strange... I mean, I'm going to give you an example here, is that I don't think many Americans realize how strange it is for us to stand and perform a ritualistic pledge of allegiance to our flag. Not only do we do it very often, it's one of the first things that was taught to me and my peers in elementary school as a young child, kindergarten. And as far as I understand, pretty much most of the Western world and beyond that, they don't do that. And when they see us doing it, they see it as this creepy and Orwellian. And I'm really not convinced that it's not creepy or Orwellian. And so... if you're going to lend that much passion, I think just that in and of itself, if it's arbitrary, it's something to be questioned. But, and while I could say that just passion in and of itself isn't a bad thing, I think there are some serious dangers that this sort of patriotism leans towards. The first and most significant danger is that it just absolutely it promotes the tribalism, and that is indisputable. And what is also indisputable is that tribalism is a nasty, ugly, and damaging thing. When I see tribalistic patriots who are America first and America's the best country in this whole world, and they go on that sort of a rant and that sort of a line of thinking, I'm picturing high school cliques in an 80s movie who are just totally antagonistic towards each other purely because they don't have the same background. And it totally cultivates xenophobia to where you are going to take so much pride in who you are and where you come from just because it's yours, to where you are going to see someone who comes from something that's different, that's not yours, and you're going to feel this very natural antagonism towards that person. And that is a tendency that I think, if you want to be really awake and observant about what goes on, that's something that's real in our country. And I think its roots are deep in patriotism. I think it's in human nature, but I think patriotism contributes so strongly to this sort of a thing. So say what you want about the nature of racism in our country today. I don't necessarily know if I want to get into that. I think there's a lot to say about racism in our country today, but let's take a moment to step back and look at some moments in our history of indisputable racism. For example, the way the Japanese were treated during World War II. It was a truly atrocious behavior in American history, and I think it's pretty obvious that it was xenophobia and not anything rational motivating that behavior. And this and that xenophobia comes from patriotism, in my judgment. And lastly, it makes people completely, willingly, almost blind to the flaws of the country that they're living in. And the fact that the country we're in right now, I listed some of the things that I think we're doing an okay job at. But there's so many things that are really wrong in our country right now. I think if you have this baseline, like, and a motivation to say that our country is the best country, purely out of the fact that saying that is a virtue, you're not going to be awake to the flaws that are going on, and you're not going to be very motivated to actively pursue the correction of those problems. Take war, for example. I think the general platitudes that get spoken about from your average patriot is that when we go to war, we're fighting for our freedom, and that we need to support our country and sacrifice for our country and support our troops because and that sort of a thing. When really the thought of whether or not is our nation being moral, is this a just war, Is this an effective war? Are we using our time, our money, and the lives of our soldiers usefully in this war? Do those thoughts do those thoughts come naturally to someone who's inundated with patriotism? And I want to say no. I don't think it does. I don't think people that thinking critically about what your country's doing is the thing that comes most naturally to someone who's really steeped in patriotism. Now, I can say this last thing is that I know that there's lots of people who would say that I am a patriot and that do a good job at all those other things, and they avoid those things and avoid those dangers. And I know that type of person exists. We're coming from a Christian perspective. The Christian church is full of these types of people. The worst examples, but also some of the best examples, probably. And I think that's why we even got this question in the first place, is because of how tightly connected Christianity and patriotism has become over the years. But the reason I believe that people succeed at being patriotic in avoiding these dangers is not because of patriotism of itself, but because of other virtues that those people have that help compensate them and help temper their approach. I think patriotism has a very natural leaning and cultivation of these things, like willful ignorance of corruption and bad behavior by your government and xenophobia and tribalism. So with that said, I think if you want to be very, very generous in how you define patriotism, you could say it is indeed a virtue. I think the way it's revealed most of the time in our culture, it is something that is ugly and dangerous and bad. So, without pulling any punches, So Kevin, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I think I disagree with you almost entirely.
Oh no.
Now, for starters, I want to recognize that I think, obviously, patriotism can be toxic. For sure. And in addition to being toxic in the ways that you mentioned, it can also be idolatrous, which is perhaps a more serious problem than the ones you mentioned. However, I would argue that patriotism is, in fact, a virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, talks about patriotism as a virtue and actually connects it in a way that might surprise a lot of us with piety. As a kind of reverence, he in fact uses the word worship, due to those to whom we are debtors. He talks about parents, he talks about country. The fact of the matter is that we are, from our very birth, beneficiaries of our family first, but our country on kind of the next level provides a similar kind of framework. But to go on and to kind of spell out more about the idea of patriotism as a virtue, what it means is that oftentimes there are two extremes that, when we can go to them, can be vices. For example, courage is a virtue. It's one of the cardinal virtues in classic Thomistic and Aristotelian philosophy. And but one can rush into danger rashly, can do so without any sense of precaution, without any care for ourselves or the lives of others, and that is what is called rashness. On the other hand, one can be a coward and can flee from any danger and can refuse to do what is necessary to stand up. The virtue lies in the middle, and the virtue is courage. Patriotism is a virtue, but there are extremes on either end that can be dangerous, and one in our country indeed is the danger of a sort of irrational nationalistic fervor. And in fact, I would call that nationalism, not patriotism, but it's, quibbling words perhaps. But on the other end, there's something that I have encountered a lot, especially amongst a lot of young friends of mine who are very upset about various things in our country. I mean, you brought up the case of racism, homophobia, and all of these things that really are problems. But they're so upset by these things that they have decided that where they live is the most evil place on earth, and it's just awesome for them to hate what they're in and to bash on America. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just as much of a vice and just as subject to tribalism and all the other dangers that you mentioned as the other side. Maybe you really like chocolate cake, and you have a really good piece of chocolate cake, and you really appreciate it. And sure, sometimes that can be gluttony, and that can be a sin, but sometimes that's a way of giving glory to God because you recognize it as a gift from God. The base instincts that drive patriotism are instincts to praise what is praiseworthy, and that is a good thing. It is a base instinct to appreciate the community into which we are born, both the good and the bad of it, and a base instinct to recognize that the particular place we are in is a particular gift to us. Now, that base instinct, like all unrefined things, very easily falls into one of two extremes, like I talked about before. Either we willfully blind ourselves to what is bad because we don't want to acknowledge it. We only want to have the warm, fuzzy feelings towards our country. Or we see what's bad and we become completely disillusioned and we decide to hate our country. Mm-hmm. And neither extreme is good. And the mean between those two extremes is, in fact, I believe, patriotism, and so it is a virtue.
I feel like, though, you are describing patriotism as the virtue in a similar way as I explained it as a virtue. I think maybe more my point is how common is that? Granted, I know that this doesn't mean we need to, this is an argument suggesting we should just do away with patriotism, but I think it's worth at least acknowledging that how common is that healthy patriotism.
Well, how common is virtue in general?
I guess that's a good point. I think what is healthy is having a sacrificial relationship with your country where your goal is to help make it a better place and to be happy when you succeed and sad when you fail. And despite success and failure, you're still devoted to it in a healthy way.
Right, which I don't think is what you were saying before, because it sounded like what you were saying before is that we only appreciate our country to the extent that it's proficient. For example, I mean, it's like when I like my car as long as my car is doing what it's supposed to do, and as soon as it stops doing what it's supposed to do, I don't like it.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that the real patriotism involves an actual, concrete love of country.
Yeah. I think really what I want to accomplish here is that I want to kind of grab our culture, American culture, and to really just point out to them how easy it is to become viceful and immoral with your patriotism, and show them how much that's really going on, and just alert them for it, and create significant reform.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of people who are quote unquote woke, 'cause that's what you're talking about.
Well, I guess so.
But I mean, people who are aware are often vicious in the opposite direction.
Yeah, well,
because.
Sure.
And I think that's where, sure, like I understand what you're saying about we need to help people have a better understanding of patriotism. But I think the cautions that you bring up are directed towards a particular kind of person. And I know that person, but I think that person tends to be someone of an older generation than us. And that people and that more and more what you're seeing in not just secular America, but even Christian America is more and more of a bitterness and an attitude of that is the opposite of.
Yeah, I suppose that I know where you're coming from, and I think I agree mostly. I guess maybe your perspective is going to come from this your little subculture sphere you're coming from, in terms of how much is it the younger and cynical type of person that hates the country, and how much is it the older, like America's the best country in the world type of a person. It's hard to tell where it's more, and I agree. I think that it's a complete other side of immorality, cynicism and spitefulness, and just being unconstructive and scathing in your perspectives on their country is just as immoral as the other side of things. I don't think that sort of thinking is really the engine that's making our country move and act legally right now. I don't think so.
I would disagree.
Legally, I think you have to stop and think about who our president is.
Well,
right
sure,
now.
but I mean, our president is not the entirety of our legal system. And
No.
So I mean, yes, absolutely. At the federal level, post Obama. So right now, in the very limited 6 months that Donald Trump has been president, we have had a toxic move towards a kind of bad nationalism parody of good patriotism.
Yeah.
But I think in the country at large, there is a strong movement towards a desire to turn America into, for example, with regards to free speech laws. America has a particular free speech tradition that is founded on the protection of nasty viewpoints in order to make a space where all viewpoints, even including the good ones, are protected, because you can't have a government power that's strong enough to, stop the nasty stuff without it also being strong enough when the next political party comes along to repress views that are good or worth hearing in the public sphere. Whereas Europe has a tradition of speech as free only to the extent that it is viewed by the current cultural atmosphere as worthwhile speech. So, for example, in Europe, hate speech laws are a big thing, and on a first blush, hate speech is a bad thing. I mean, we don't want hate speech. I mean, ideally, we would have a world in which there was no hate speech, but the question then becomes the judgment of that, and at the end of the day, you end up having a very toxic environment in which speech is stifled and people cannot have free conversation. And so, and that is more and more becoming the case, first and foremost in America in college campuses, but in America abroad, there are a lot of legal thinkers, legal activists who are pushing, not just theoretically, but with these very concrete examples, and with these and with actually referencing Europe, saying America is bad, we want to be more like Europe. We want to be that thing, not what we are. So I don't think that the sort of ascendant, toxic attitude that we see in Donald Trump is the only thing we have going on in America. And I think there is a very active, legally significant portion of America that is doing the opposite.
I guess it's true. I guess, I don't know. I can't cite numbers or anything like that about which side is more. I think it's, I do think that it's sort of easy to get where we live, which is Portland, very liberal, part of the nation, that where you're surrounded by that type of person who, America sucks and burn it down, whatever.
Sure, yeah.
Where that's really what we're surrounded with, probably mostly. And I think also the media, people cite the media all the time to match whatever ideology they have and saying the media is against me, but I do think that the media does have a more liberal leaning. So yeah. I think you can get the perspective, I don't know if this is where you're coming from, that there really are more that type of person in this world, judging based on our immediate surroundings in the media. First of all, the whole slogan, I don't want this to be too political, but make America great again, and then how we've somehow kind of that the patriotic population of our country has come to the conclusion somehow that the biggest problems we're facing right now is refugees and Mexican immigrants. When I think if you really want to stop and look at those issues and the numbers and all that stuff, you find out the only reason you come to the conclusion that those are such huge problems is because you're being tribal and tribalistic and xenophobic, and in the baseline thing, the way they would frame it, they obviously aren't going to call themselves xenophobic or tribal, but they're going to say, well, I'm a patriot and I love America and I want to protect America. And I think that is more of a reality than right now that our country's facing than us trying to just have a coup d'etat. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think a coup d'etat is a danger, and I certainly I'm not going to get into the question of immigration because there's so much loaded into that question.
Yeah, I know.
that I wouldn't even know where to start. But I think So for example, and I'm not talking about your sort of ideal person you mentioned earlier, but for example, I mean, the narrative that a lot of journalists who are having an arguably over the top, but at the very least very fervent journalistic campaign against the current White House, and very few people would deny that. Most of the journalists are very open about the fact that that's what they're doing. See what they're doing as a defense of democracy, as a defense of this country, as a patriotic act. So I don't think that it's fair to frame patriotism only in terms of your angry uncle on Facebook or whoever.
We all have one.
We all do. And I don't think the danger is from something like a coup d'etat. I think the danger is from patriotism, if nothing else. Good patriotism fuels, and even to a certain extent, over the top patriotism fuels civic engagement, fuels the kinds of like middle America angry people you're talking about came out in droves to vote for Trump, and I don't think that was a good thing. Like, voting for Trump was not a good thing, but their desire to engage that was motivated by these feelings that had become largely atrophied in them, getting stirred up for whatever reason, some of them good, some of them bad, that when you have a kind of apathy and anger I'm talking about, it causes a breakdown of communal bonds, it causes a breakdown of communal engagement, it fuels, a lot of leftist identity politics that have not, thank God, reached the level yet of like domestic terrorism or anything like that, but they have in the past. In the 1970s, that sort of civil unrest and malaise in response to things like Vietnam led to all kinds of things like bombings in America that I think are very much a danger for our culture to go in that direction.
Well, I agree. I don't necessarily feel like I have to choose between like defending that sort of thinking, because I don't want to defend that sort of thinking, because I do think it's dangerous. I do think it's bad. It's definitely immoral from a Christian perspective, I think. But I guess really what is that it's just, to me, that's not the main focus right now that I think our country, in terms of addressing patriotism in our country, I don't think that is the biggest issue. And again,
I think you're wrong. I think we could go around in circles like this
right. I think
all night.
I think
we could be a 5-hour podcast.
We're going to settle just the fact that we disagree. Like I said, you gotta look at who was at the top and what sort of really serious
that's not the most important
political.
thing
Well, what are the political choices our country is making right now in terms of and all that sort of stuff? It's definitely on the into the excessive patriotic side of things, in my judgment. I think maybe on a more ground level, this may be true that the unrest and cynicism and that sort of stuff is pretty prevalent, and it is affecting the minds of a lay person, and I don't like that either. But in the Christian community, and if there's anyone listening who's not in a Christian community regularly, I think you're going to find more excessive patriots, and this is in my experiences, than you're going to find the other side of things, and so that's my little sphere that I'm working with, I guess.
Yeah. I think that is because patriotism is in fact a virtue. It's both a natural virtue, but it is a virtue that Christianity encourages.
Well,
and so because that impulse is already present in the Christian community, it is more likely in there for its distorted version to come up.
I think it's present in Christianity because it's become intertwined with Christianity, and politics and patriotism has gotten intertwined, and there's just sort of like this decency sort of a thing where it's like patriotism's right next to apple pie and baseball, and it's just you do.
And I'm just as appalled as you, maybe more so when Christian churches fly American flags or in the middle of their
And that's so
worship
much less. That's so
services,
much
but-
less serious than the things I'm thinking of. If you're going to be bothered by that,
I'm not sure it is, but I think we need to wrap this up. We could keep going for a while. Maybe we'll have a part 2. Please hit us up on Facebook if you have comments or questions or concerns. You can find us on Facebook by searching for Mystery of Faith, Understanding the Christian Religion, or you can email us at mysteryoffaithpdx@gmail.com. Please come at us with questions. We'd love to have more questions because this podcast, by its very nature, depends on you asking us questions.
yeah, argue with us. Tell us why we're wrong.
Yeah, tell Jacob why he's wrong.
Yeah.
All right, God bless.
All right. Good night, rednecks.